everyone, in this video I'm going to go over my unscripted thoughts on Wringer. I did this with S-Blast a while back, and now that I've played Dread for a little over a month and gotten used to it in its current state, I want to talk about it because I find it very interesting. Just a small note before I start, I already talked about slider cheese in its own video. I'm not going to talk about it here because I think it's the most boring part of the discussion, but TLDR, it sucks, it's not fun, it's not good for the game. So, what are the things that I think makes Dread a really interesting support option? Well, first off, I think that the main weapon is kind of interesting because it's a little bit of a semi-auto in a way, where you fire 2 sloshes for each time you press CR. But compared to the others like L3 and H3, I think you got a lot more utility out of this because every time you slosh, you're making a decision between spreading out the sloshes for better paint and better damage, like spread out over an area, but less in one place. Whereas if you slosh 2 sloshes at the same spot, your paint output is significantly reduced, but you have much heavier damage output. I think that's an interesting trade-off between how you choose to fire the weapon. It makes it feel like it has 2 firing modes in a way. Obviously, sometimes you can hit people with 2 sloshes if they're moving around at the same time, which is just really fun to do. It feels good to like read where opponents are going, because you definitely have to lead your shots a little bit and try to predict where people are moving, rather than shooting exactly where they are. The weapon's also mid-ranged, which I like about it. It's interesting to see supports that are more mid-range, because typically most of them are short-range or shooters. I think the only comparable one is Wringer, which definitely falls under more of an anchor role. So this one is comfortably playing in mid-range, and that's something that's been really lacking in this game. Splatoon 2 had H3 fill that role for the longest time, and we might get that back at some point, but H3 definitely seems a little more selfish in this game. So I think it's cool to have this mid-range support idea, because I really like triple midline comps. In fact, I'd say triple midline is probably my favorite thing to play. It doesn't have to be something with Dread. It's really fun to play with Dually Squelcher. It could be a thing with Forge after the buffs. You know, kind of doubt. I don't think Forge is like a full-on fighting weapon. I don't think any of these are, but I do think having these mid-range weapons with a bit more paint output, access to a bomb, special utility, is an interesting way to open up comps to be feeling a little bit different, rather than just the traditional 1 short range, 2 mid-range, 1 anchor weapon. I think the area where it's most unique, though, is definitely AoE for support. Pretty much every support weapon shoots very line of sight, and even Wringer, again the other exception for this, doesn't get a whole lot out of it, because Wringer's not that great at fighting solo with its vertical flick. I think Dread actually will take fights over ledges and gets much more poking ability out of it. So it changes the positions you can generally gravitate to as a support to a lot more locations where you have some form of cover or are poking under. It's very similar to where Bucket plays, but again, being more support focused for the weapon is kind of fun. And I think that's the main thing I've really enjoyed personally, because I definitely still like taking fights with this weapon and being aggressive at times, but being able to mix that in with a more supportive playstyle is really fun for me. And it's kind of a trend I've been enjoying in general with the more recent stuff, with weapons like Zimmy or Mint Decapitator or Vanilla Splash coming back into the meta. I like more of these weapons that are a bit more flexible between the different playstyles they do, because I think sometimes the weapons, rather they're mid-range or supports, being too linear into one role makes their playstyle a little just kind of bland to me. It's not really gonna lead to any moments where I watch the weapon and I'm surprised at a decision they do. Whereas I think these weapons that have so many different things they have access to, even if it's not great at all of them, provide a lot more interesting situations where the player has to make a decision between what kind of option they're trying to go for. And so I think that makes it a bit more interesting for me just to watch, but also to play. I like being able to go through that kind of decision making in a match. It feels like there's a lot more to think about. Let's talk about the kit real quick. I like the suction bomb on it just fine. It doesn't help with fighting as much as Splat Bomb. Splat Bomb would be a big deal for going for 90s and getting a quick bomb out of it, like Bucket can. But I think that suction on it is totally fine. It paints a lot, it's good to pressure, and it feels like you get a good amount of them. A lot of mid-range weapons have ink efficiency issues that make you feel like it's really hard to use your kit until Last Ditch is active. And while Dread definitely benefits from Last Ditch, I do feel like I can actually use my bomb with it. And on top of that, I do really like using Slider with the weapon outside of Slider Cheese. It is really fun to use it as your main way to go aggressive, because any one hit from Dread comboing with the 70 hit means you can kind of just fish for damage and try to bait people. I think Slider is fun to use. It has like a little bit of M lag, of course, so it does feel a little bit linear to jump out most of the time, but the kind of angles you're trying to do where you want a slider in these like diagonal corners to avoid hitting walls or finding locations you can do, the little slide tech you can do to go a little bit further afterward, all of that is really fun. I feel like the special does actually have a decent amount of things to learn and get used to despite the big hitbox, which makes it fun for me. And in general, I think it definitely pushes Dread very aggressive, which I think was intended here. Dread clearly paints a ridiculously good amount, so I can see what the devs were going for, pairing it with a special that forced it to go in and get some kills. There might have been concerns over the weapon playing too passively, which kind of funny, it just does that anyway in zones because we let it cap the zone, but you know, I think the intent there is definitely something I can respect a bit more now that the special is in a functional spot. It's definitely a bit harder to use against other specials than it looks, since obviously you're going to slider and you're going to be in a very risky position if you don't play off of Cooler. But being able to use the large blast radius to break something like Crab, and again maybe Booyah Bomb if it's more popular, from a really far away distance is something that's kind of fun. And then Bubble is much more about trying to run it over or get your explosion inside the bubble. But it feels like there's always options for the other player. Even for stuff like Bubble, I fought against Gray a few times, and the amount of small little height elevations he manages to press the bubble on that I can't end up sliding over makes me feel like the matchup is not as bad for Bubble as I thought, compared to something like Strike, where no matter where you place the bubble, I guess it's going to always be able to hit you. So that's kind of fun. I think that it ends up working out because it still has enough supportive tendencies. It's just really big for team fights. You really try to use it for the 70 damage, and even if you don't kill off it yourself, you have two other weapons that should be dealing high amounts of damage if you're playing an optimal Dread comp, so you're going to have a lot of other weapons that should be able to find kills off your Reach Slider, so that's been kind of fun to use for me, so I've enjoyed it a lot more. I still really wish I had another option, because Slider by itself is a little bit boring at times, especially when you have to go for zone caps. So it would be nice to have a little bit more of an alternate, but unless third kits pop out of nowhere, I don't know if we're going to see anything with that. I will say, though, probably my least favorite part about Slider right now is how dependent it is on Cooler. I mentioned it a little bit ago, but if you have Cooler, you can Cooler QSJ out and actually live. Outside of that, your options are all so slow and weak by comparison. It's definitely a weird symptom of how they balance the end lag on this. I don't think any other special is as dependent on Cooler to be used. Like, you can use it without Cooler, and that's especially why QR is solid for it, but if you don't use it with Cooler, it's so much more risky, it's so much worse a special because of how good that bumper jump out is. I wish it was a little more balanced between its other options. I guess I'll talk about Dread D briefly. I have actually played it a little bit, just on the side, and realistically, I don't think it feels that bad, mostly because Dread as a main weapon is solid, and the damage with Wave could be a little bit helpful. But the kit just isn't really that powerful. I think the beacons are the thing I dislike the most. I normally don't mind beacons as a sub, but with Wringer, it feels like I always have something better I can do between fighting people or painting, to where I never really want to go place beacons down. It's just something where I think the weapon has so many things it can do in so many different situations that it doesn't really need another thing to be responsible for. And then having both a sub and special that doesn't paint at all really feels like it's not taking advantage of the weapon shrinks at all. Maybe it could work better if Wave ever gets a buff one day, because you do still get a lot of Wave breakers. But realistically, the other kit feels like it does enhance a lot of the flexibility the main weapon has between its toolkit, and Dread D really doesn't. It feels like it's trying to give it a supportive archetype, but it doesn't really lean into doing anything particularly well, nor does it enhance the main weapon at all. I definitely stand by this being like top 5 most disappointing kits in this game. I really don't see the vision for it at all. But yeah, at the end of the day, this discussion ended up being way less smaller than I had to say, mostly because a lot of what I wanted to say ended up being in the main channel video about if Dread can win a major, so I don't have too much more I want to add to it. But I will say that I think the main weapon gets a bit of a bad rap because of slider cheese, but it is legitimately fun between the different damage you can do, the roll flexibility, Reach Slider being like very fun outside of the slider cheese, the different comps you can run, the triple midline idea, and just having a support that feels so different than all of the others is really good. I think this is most similar to S1 Dynamo, and nothing has existed close to S1 Dynamo since Splatoon 1. So it's really nice to have something like that. It'd be cool if Dynamo painted too. I think it would be very similar role-wise with Dread. I would love to play both, but as of the time of scripting this Dynamo's just not in the same spot paint-wise. It doesn't seem that bad on paper, but in practice, Dread just turfs everything, and Dynamo is constantly struggling to do the same thing, so that's why I don't really use it as much. But yeah, I still think the main weapon is very cool. I'm glad I'm ending up using it and finding something that I'm comfortable with and doing better with, and yeah, that's a little bit about why I like the weapon. Anyway, I'll just leave the rest of the solo match.